The Galactic Unity Academy had stood for nearly 2 centuries, carved into the side of a dying red moon orbiting a neutral star. It was the proving ground of the galaxy's most promising young minds. Soldiers, engineers, diplomats, trained by war-hardened instructors who had seen the worst the stars could offer. No species ever joined without merit. No cadet was accepted without recommendation from at least 3 worlds. The instructors had shaped minds from across 12 star systems. They had seen arrogance, brilliance, fear, and courage. But this year, they faced something entirely new. Humans. The Earth shuttle didn't arrive with ceremony. It didn't hum or glide like the sleek crafts of the Diraxi or the shimmering crystal skiffs of the Velari. It landed with a thud. Some instructors flinched at the audible clank when its landing gear locked into the platform. From the airlock emerged 12 figures, shorter than expected, oddly proportioned compared to the tall, elegant forms of most species gathered. They didn't wear matching armor. One had a scarf. Another wore dark-tinted glasses. A third had a piece of duct tape on their boot. Instead of stepping in rigid formation, they strolled out like they were arriving at a summer camp. Instructor Corval stood at the front of the welcoming assembly, arms folded across his chest. His species, the Drexeri, valued precision, honor, uniformity. He watched the human group with the same expression he wore in battle, quiet calculation, just short of judgment. "Where is their formation?" hissed a Jireni lieutenant beside him. "They're scattered." "They're not soldiers," murmured Corval. "Not yet." The lead human stepped forward. A young woman. Average height, sharp eyes, relaxed posture. She offered a nod that was almost casual. "Cadet Mason, reporting for training," she said, "on behalf of Earth." Her voice was calm. Not defiant, but not deferential either. Just present. She might have been reading a weather report. Corval studied her, then the group behind her. Some were exchanging glances. One stifled a laugh. Another leaned over and whispered something. The others smirked. They didn't look afraid. They didn't look impressed either. That was what struck Corval the most. The Galactic Unity Academy was the most advanced training institution in known space. Cadets had passed out on this landing pad from pure nerves. But the humans? They looked like they were on vacation. "Very well," Corval said, voice rough as gravel. "You are now cadets of the Academy. You will address instructors with full title, follow standard procedure, and adhere to the code of discipline expected of all sentients." Mason nodded. Understood. As they followed the attending officer inside, Corval remained rooted in place. Something didn't feel right. He'd seen arrogance before, and fear, and recklessness. But what he saw in these humans wasn't any of those. It was something else. Comfort in the unknown. And that, he thought, might be the most dangerous thing of all. The Galactic Unity Academy's vast simulation halls buzzed with the low hum of machinery, a state-of-the-art system designed to test cadets in every possible scenario: combat, engineering, survival, and even diplomacy. The walls flickered with holographic projections, casting alien landscapes across the floor. Today's simulation was set to test teamwork and strategy, a trial every cadet had to pass before moving on to the more difficult exercises. Corval stood in the observation room, his arms crossed as he surveyed the assembly of cadets, alien and human alike, preparing for the exercise. He had hoped to keep the humans in line with the same drills, but he'd seen their behavior during their introduction, and he had a growing sense that they would be different. It was hard to explain. They didn't seem scared or awed by the grandeur of the academy. It was as though they were simply here to learn, and nothing else. Today's simulation, Corval's voice boomed, amplified by the room's speakers, will test your ability to retrieve a high-value target from an enemy stronghold. There will be obstacles. There will be danger. And you must work together, using every resource available to you. The cadets were briefed on the rules. The simulation would throw environmental hazards at them: acid rain, moving ground, hostile drones, and the like. But the core of the test was teamwork. They would be graded on how well they cooperated, how they handled threats, and whether they followed protocol. The alien cadets, many from species known for their discipline and precision, exchanged knowing glances, checking each other's gear, preparing themselves for what they knew would be a textbook operation. There was no room for error. They had trained for this moment their entire lives. Then the human stepped forward, as casual as ever. Mason gave her team a nod. Two of the others were adjusting their gear. The others were checking devices, and one was smiling, as if this was all just another day in a training exercise. "We're good to go," Mason said. She didn't sound like she was addressing the room or even Corval, but more like she was speaking to her own team. Her tone was confident, perhaps a little too confident. Corval watched as the simulation doors slid open, and the teams poured into the virtual battlefield. The simulation projected a desolate alien world. Barren landscapes stretched beneath a heavy purple sky. The enemy stronghold was in the distance, but the path to it was filled with dangers. Drones hovered in the air, scanning the terrain. The ground itself was unstable, shifting beneath their feet. Within seconds, the human team had scattered. The Drexeri team, as expected, formed a perfect line. Their weapons were ready, their minds focused on tactics. The others followed suit, scanning the environment, moving in precise formation. But the humans. Mason took one look at the situation and turned away from the direct path. She darted toward an outcrop of rocks, waving her team along. Another human, Cadet James, pulled out a handful of what looked like scraps and started tying them together, creating some kind of makeshift contraption. The rest of the human team followed without hesitation, darting in every direction, doing things no one had taught them. They were making their own rules. Corval's eyes narrowed. No one else was doing this. One of the alien instructors muttered, "They're going off script." "I don't think they have a script," Corval replied, his voice laced with something he didn't want to admit, curiosity. Minutes passed. The other cadets were still carefully advancing, taking calculated steps, clearing obstacles, and eliminating threats with methodical precision. But the humans, they were improvising. When a drone swooped down to intercept them, one of the humans, Cadet Lee, grabbed a rock, threw it with uncanny accuracy, and knocked out the drone's targeting system. The others ran toward the drone, scavenging its components, and laughing, as though the whole thing were a game. They were not following any protocols, not using standard equipment in any way. And yet, somehow, they were getting closer to the target. Corval watched, conflicted. He had seen everything from military brilliance to chaos in battle, but nothing like this. The humans didn't just follow the patterns or use the best-known tactics. They were unpredictable. And that, Corval realized, might just be the key to understanding them. The simulation ended as quickly as it had begun. The teams were called back to the central chamber, where they were to meet for debriefing. Corval's eyes remained on the human cadets as they filed into the room, still chatting amongst themselves, laughing and patting each other on the back. Despite the high-stakes environment of the simulation, they didn't seem remotely fazed. The alien cadets, on the other hand, looked a bit more serious, exchanging uncertain glances. They'd followed the rules. They'd operated as they'd been taught, but the humans had done something different. Something unexpected, and it had worked. Corval was already standing at the front of the room, his expression unreadable. The other instructors filed in behind him, ready to give their assessments. As the teams gathered in front of the monitors, Corval activated the holographic playback of the simulation. The room went silent, and all eyes turned to the screen. The footage was an odd sight. Where the alien teams had moved in uniform, the humans had darted across the field in a chaotic zigzag pattern, taking risks that Corval could hardly fathom. In one part of the simulation, the human team had completely abandoned the direct route to the objective and instead used the unstable terrain to their advantage, bypassing enemy drones and environmental hazards in ways no one could have predicted. Corval's voice cut through the stillness. "Let's begin with the Drexari team," he said, his tone firm. "Report." The Drexari team leader stepped forward, speaking with calm precision. "We adhered to the mission's protocols, utilizing proper formations and equipment. We faced some difficulty with the terrain shift, but our movements were precise. We reached the target in 15 minutes. Corval nodded, then turned to the next team. The Velari. The Velari cadet, tall and graceful, replied with equal professionalism. "We encountered an unexpected drone patrol, but it was easily neutralized with our tech. We reached the objective with minimal losses." Corval glanced toward the humans, who stood apart from the rest, looking surprisingly relaxed. They didn't seem at all concerned by the imminent critiques. He pressed a button, and the screen shifted, now showing footage of the humans. They had split up at the beginning, with no obvious coordination, but they were moving, improvising, solving problems in real time. They took shortcuts that made no logical sense, yet somehow they worked. Corval paused the footage. He studied the human cadets. "Cadet Mason, I must ask, why did you choose to deviate from the standard strategy?" He addressed the lead human, who looked as though she was still processing the question. Mason shrugged nonchalantly. "The path you gave us wasn't the only way to complete the mission. We noticed opportunities to save time and energy, so we took them." She paused, glancing around at her team. There wasn't any reason to follow rules just for the sake of following them. The goal was to finish, and we did. The other cadets shifted uncomfortably. The Velari exchanged a glance. The Drexari were stone-faced, but there was something in Corval's eyes that made the air feel tense. "Discipline is key to survival," Corval said slowly. "You cannot expect to win battles by bending the rules at whim." Mason met his gaze with an intensity that surprised him. "We didn't bend the rules. We used our judgment. Every decision was made because we thought it would work, and it did." She motioned toward the screen. "We finished faster, with no casualties. That's not bending the rules, sir. That's just thinking." The room went silent. Corval's mind raced. It was clear that the humans had done something no one expected, something that should have been reckless, but had instead led to success. They weren't following a script. They weren't even following basic logic. They were using something else, something intuitive. "Are you suggesting that all your training, our training, is irrelevant?" An instructor from the Sherek species asked, his voice laced with skepticism. Mason's reply was simple, but it hung in the air like a challenge. "No, we're just saying that there's more than one way to get things done." Corval blinked, his mind suddenly awash with new questions. He had spent decades training, refining strategies, teaching young minds the importance of structure and order. But what he was hearing today felt new, disturbingly so. He stood in front of the room, fighting the rush of conflicting thoughts. He was an instructor at the most elite academy in the galaxy. He had seen every form of military tactics, every style of combat. Yet this human approach, it didn't fit into his categories. The room remained still, the only sound the soft hum of the academy's ventilation. The air was thick with contemplation. Corval exhaled slowly. "This is far from over, but you've made your point." He glanced at the rest of the instructors, then back at Mason. "Tomorrow, you will face another exercise. I expect you to follow the rules this time." Mason smiled slightly. "We'll try." The next day, the Academy's central training room was filled with tension. Cadets gathered in neat rows, all eyes on the instructors. The previous day's debrief was still fresh in everyone's mind. Corval stood at the front, his expression stern. Today's test would be different. It would challenge their instincts, their ability to think on their feet. "All of you will participate in a simulation," Corval began, his voice cutting through the air. "The goal is survival. You will be dropped into a hostile environment, with no prior knowledge of the terrain, no time to plan. You must adapt, using whatever resources you can find. Your success will not be measured by how quickly you finish, but by how you handle the unexpected. The alien cadets stood tall, confident in their training. They had been through countless tests like this before. Their minds were sharp, their reflexes honed. They understood the importance of maintaining discipline, of sticking to the plan. But the humans, Corval, had no idea what to expect. He had given them a simple directive: follow the rules. But he knew, deep down, that these humans weren't going to do that. They never did. The simulation began. The cadets were teleported to a barren, windswept plain. The sky above was a sickly green, and jagged rock formations stretched into the distance. It was the perfect place for a test of survival, a place where resources were scarce, and the terrain was unpredictable. The alien cadets immediately began working together, coordinating their efforts to establish a defensive perimeter. They checked their gear, set up barriers, and kept a constant lookout for threats. They were calm, methodical, and efficient. The humans, however, had a different approach. Mason immediately scanned the environment, her eyes flicking from one rock formation to the next. Without a word, she signaled her team, and they scattered in different directions. One of the humans, Cadet Lee, quickly gathered a handful of rocks, while another, Cadet Rodriguez, began dismantling the nearby sensor tower. Corval's eyes narrowed as he watched them. They weren't sticking to the protocol. They weren't staying in formation. They were working independently, making decisions on the fly, without consulting the others. And yet, they weren't failing. A drone appeared overhead, its sharp metallic wings gleaming in the alien light. It zipped toward the cadets, scanning for movement. The alien cadets froze, instinctively falling into formation to avoid detection. But the humans, they scattered. Mason dove behind a rock, rolling smoothly to the other side. Lee hurled a rock at the drone, disorienting it just long enough for Rodriguez to hack into its systems and take control. The drone stuttered in midair before hovering inertly. Corval's eyes widened. The humans had anticipated the drone's movements before it even arrived. They had acted without hesitation, without fear. They had used their surroundings to their advantage in a way the other cadets hadn't. The alien cadets were already setting up traps, moving in a structured pattern. But the humans weren't interested in traps. They were thinking ahead. Lee, using the dismantled sensor tower, had fashioned a makeshift weapon, a slingshot capable of launching rock projectiles at an impressive range. Meanwhile, Mason was scouting ahead, already planning the next move, the next step in their survival. Corval's fingers tapped on the console, reviewing their progress. The human team was moving forward at an alarming rate. They were covering ground faster than anyone had expected, and they weren't just surviving, they were thriving. The other cadets were starting to take notice. The Velari team leader, once dismissive of the humans, now watched them closely, a flicker of respect in his eyes. Even the Drexeri team, known for their military discipline, began to question their own methods. Corval could feel a knot of unease tightening in his chest. The humans weren't playing the game the way it was meant to be played. They were using something else. Something instinctual. They weren't relying on their training, their plans, or even the structure of the simulation. They were relying on something deeper. It wasn't until the end of the exercise that Corval understood what that something was. When the simulation ended, he scanned the final results. The humans had completed the mission in half the time of the other cadets. No casualties, no errors, and their approach had been entirely unorthodox. As Mason and her team returned to the starting zone, they wore their usual relaxed expressions, as if they'd just completed a casual walk. Corval found himself staring at them, struggling to reconcile what he had just witnessed with everything he had ever taught. "You did well," he said, his voice begrudgingly respectful. Mason smiled. "Thanks, but we're just getting started." It was only halfway through the training cycle when disaster struck. The Academy's warning system blared to life, an urgent, unrelenting tone that echoed throughout the complex. Corval, who had been reviewing mission data in his office, stiffened. The lights flickered, then dimmed as the alert grew louder. Incoming breach, a voice crackled through the comms. Cargo Satellite 372 is on a collision course with the Academy. Impact estimated in 12 minutes. The Academy's internal network scrambled into action. Staff and cadets rushed to their designated emergency posts. The outer dome began to close, but it wouldn't be enough. The collision was imminent. Corval stood, a grim determination settling over him. This wasn't a simulation. This was real. Cadets Mason, Lee, and Rodriguez report to the Central Command immediately. The voice continued. The human team's name had been called first, and Corval understood why. Despite their chaotic approach to training, the humans had demonstrated an uncanny ability to solve problems under pressure. And this wasn't a time for textbook solutions. This was an emergency. Within minutes, Mason and her team arrived at the command center. The room was filled with frantic chatter as instructors and engineers tried to coordinate a response. The Academy's protective systems had been activated, but they weren't designed for something of this scale. The satellite was too large, and its trajectory was too erratic. Corval watched Mason, Lee, and Rodriguez as they approached the central console. Mason's face was unreadable, but her posture was calm, almost casual. The others were already in motion, studying the simulation data on the holo panels. They didn't wait for orders. They began brainstorming. Their movements were fluid, a rhythm Corval hadn't expected to see. "Satellite's hull is already breached," Lee said, pointing at the screen. "It's spinning out of control. If we can't stop it, the collision's gonna breach the entire dome." Mason looked at him, then at Rodriguez. "We're not stopping it. We're slowing it down." Corval stepped forward. "How?" Without missing a beat, Mason tapped a few keys, pulling up the satellite's schematics. "We've got a few options. First, we'll need to reroute power to the thrusters. We can't use the standard emergency protocols. They're too slow. We'll need to rig a redirect." "You think you can do this in time?" Corval asked, his voice tight. She didn't hesitate. "We don't have a choice." The others had already split up, each one working furiously. Rodriguez was accessing the Academy's drone fleet, reprogramming them to assist in stabilizing the satellite's descent. Lee was prepping the emergency override for the main reactor, preparing to siphon power from other systems to fuel the thrusters. Corval stood in stunned silence. The human cadets didn't ask for permission. They didn't wait for orders. They just began working, each one focused on the task in front of them, thinking faster than anyone else in the room. They were defying all protocols, but in a way that seemed almost natural. As the minutes ticked down, Corval felt a knot of tension in his stomach. The situation was dire. The engineers were still scrambling to stabilize the satellite's path, but the humans had done something different. Instead of panic, they had simply adapted. Finally, just as the countdown hit 5 minutes, the satellite's course shifted. A sudden, controlled deceleration. The human team had done it. They had taken the satellite's remaining power, redirected it through emergency channels, and slowed its descent just enough to keep the Academy's dome intact. The room fell into stunned silence. Engineers and instructors stood, mouths agape, watching the monitors. "You did it," Corval said, his voice low, a mixture of disbelief and reluctant admiration. The other cadets, who had been watching from the sidelines, exchanged nervous glances. They hadn't been part of the solution. The humans had saved the Academy, and no one saw it coming. Mason looked over at Corval, her eyes flashing with the same confidence she always carried. "We didn't do it alone," she said. "We just got creative with what we had." Lee smirked. "If we'd waited for protocol, we'd still be waiting for clearance." Corval's mind raced. There was something about the humans, something that no one else seemed to understand. They weren't afraid to challenge expectations, to break away from the norm, even when it seemed impossible. And in doing so, they had just saved the Academy. The aftermath of the satellite breach was a mixture of awe and unease. Corval and the other instructors stood in the debriefing room, watching as cadets filed out, still processing the gravity of what had just happened. The human team had acted decisively, saving the Academy from what could have been a catastrophic event. They hadn't followed the protocols, hadn't waited for orders, but they had succeeded where others might have faltered. Corval's mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts. He had watched them operate under pressure, and it was unlike anything he had seen before. The humans didn't play by the same rules. They thought in ways that didn't fit within the rigid structures of the Academy. And somehow, that made them dangerous. Dangerous in a way he couldn't quite define. He glanced toward Mason, who stood at the edge of the room with her team. They looked unbothered by the chaos that had just unfolded, as though it had been just another day of the office. Their casual demeanor didn't sit well with some of the other instructors, who still wore expressions of disbelief. The Villari, ever so graceful and poised, exchanged uneasy glances with the Drexari team. Their precision and discipline had been called into question. "You did well," Corval said, approaching the human team. Mason gave him a look of acknowledgement. "Thanks. But I think we all did well." "Don't get complacent," Corval warned. "What you did today, that kind of thinking might work in the short term, but it's not a sustainable approach. The galaxy does not forgive mistakes." Mason met his gaze, her eyes steady. "We didn't make a mistake. We adapted. Maybe that's what you're missing." Corval narrowed his eyes. "Adaptation is one thing. Recklessness is another." She shook her head slightly, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "We'll see. I don't think you understand how much we've had to adapt just to survive on Earth. What we did today was instinct. It's not about rules. It's about finding the way forward when everything else is falling apart." Corval stood there for a moment, unsure how to respond. He had spent his entire career emphasizing structure, precision, and adherence to protocol. Yet the humans, these wild cards, had just demonstrated something he had never considered: that in chaos there could be clarity. The room buzzed with nervous energy as the instructors turned to their next task. The Academy would continue, and there were still many challenges ahead. But Corval knew that what he had just witnessed would forever change the way he approached his training. And as unsettling as it was, he couldn't help but feel that the humans were showing him something important. For all their recklessness, for all their unorthodox methods, they had something the others didn't. They had instinct, the ability to improvise in ways that no amount of training could replicate. It was an edge. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized how dangerous that edge could be. "I'm calling for a new challenge," Corval said, his voice firm. "One that will test the very limits of your capabilities. We will see, once and for all, whether your instincts are enough to carry you through. Prepare yourselves." Mason's eyes gleamed, a challenge in her gaze. "We're ready." Corval turned, but before he could leave the room, he heard her voice again. "Don't worry, sir. We're just getting started." As he walked out of the room, a deep sense of foreboding settled in his chest. This new test would push every cadet to their limits. But deep down, he knew something else. It wouldn't just be the human cadets who would be tested. It would be the Academy itself. The tension in the Academy was palpable in the days leading up to the next challenge. Corval had promised something unprecedented, a test unlike any the cadets had faced before. Rumors swirled in the halls. Some said it would be a full-scale war simulation. Others whispered about dangerous environmental tests designed to break even the most seasoned veterans. But no one truly knew what to expect. Corval stood in front of the assembled cadets, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a rare intensity. Behind him, the large screen flickered to life, revealing a holographic map of a harsh alien world. The terrain was jagged and unforgiving. Volcanic mountains, arid deserts, and dense, hostile jungles. A place where survival would be the ultimate test. "This," Corvol's voice boomed, "is your challenge. You will be dropped into this hostile environment with nothing but your skills and your wits. No supplies, no external assistance. You will need to rely on everything you've learned, and everything you are. The environment itself will be your enemy, but your fellow cadets may be just as dangerous." Mason, standing at the front of her team, exchanged a glance with Lee and Rodriguez. This was exactly what they had trained for, an unpredictable environment where improvisation was not just necessary, but essential. Corvol paused, his eyes scanning the room. "The objective is simple. Retrieve an object of great importance hidden deep within the jungle. But you will not be alone in this endeavor. Each team will face off against others. You will be in constant competition, and the first team to retrieve the object and return to the extraction point will be declared the winner." The cadets looked uneasy at the mention of competition. Though they had all trained together, the prospect of a test that pitted them against one another was unnerving, especially after the recent incident with the satellite breach. "Prepare yourselves," Corvol continued. "Your strategies will determine whether you succeed or fail. Your instincts will determine whether you survive." With that, the cadets were swiftly escorted to the drop zone. The simulation team began setting up the equipment. The drop pods would take them to different locations on the planet's surface, each facing unique challenges. The stakes had been raised. This was no longer a test of simple teamwork. It was a test of survival, strategy, and ingenuity under pressure. As Mason stepped into the drop pod, she could feel the weight of what lay ahead. This time, they weren't just going to improvise. They were going to have to outthink and outmaneuver the other teams. They had to win. But more than that, they had to prove something. To Corvol, to themselves. Once sealed inside, she and her team were given the final briefing. The pod would land in the heart of the jungle. They had no maps, no clear sense of direction, and no idea what dangers the environment would throw their way. But they had one thing that the others didn't: their unique ability to adapt. "This is it," Mason said, turning to her team with a grin. "Time to show them how it's done." The countdown began. With each passing second, the air seemed to grow thicker, the gravity of the situation more real. But there was no turning back now. They were about to be thrown into the heart of the unknown. And they would face it head-on, as they always did, on their own terms. The drop pods plummeted through the planet's atmosphere, their metal hulls screaming as they cut through the thick, swirling clouds. Inside, the cadets were jolted and tossed, their nerves fraying with each violent twist. For a moment, all Mason could hear was the steady thrum of the pod's engines and the rush of wind outside. Her heart raced, but her focus remained unbroken. As the pod's descent slowed, the world outside seemed to settle into eerie silence. The systems hummed as the ground approached, an untamed jungle stretching as far as the eye could see, its dense canopy barely pierced by the dim light of the distant sun. "Race for impact," the pod's automated voice called out. With a sudden, bone-rattling crash, the pod slammed into the ground. Dust and debris erupted around them. Mason was thrown against her harness, but quickly righted herself, eyes scanning the interface for damage reports. "Everyone okay?" Mason asked, looking to her team. Lee and Rodriguez gave quick nods. They were used to this by now, their bodies already in motion, moving to unstrap from the harnesses. "We've got our mission," Lee said, a smile creeping across his face. "Find the object. Get to the extraction point." Simple. Mason raised an eyebrow. Simple. In this jungle. Rodriguez gave a short laugh, pulling his gear from the compartment. "Nothing about this is simple. Let's move." They quickly exited the pod, stepping into the thick, humid air. The jungle was alive, a symphony of sounds, distant roars, and the rustle of unseen creatures. The underbrush was dense, and the ground was uneven, forcing them to watch each step. Ahead, a signal blinked on Mason's tracker. The object they needed to retrieve was deep within the jungle, buried in an ancient, crumbling temple, She glanced at the rest of the team. "We head east. The terrain's rough, but we need to stay ahead of the others. We're in competition now." Lee nodded, his eyes glinting with determination. "Let's go." As they navigated the dense foliage, Mason's mind raced. The other teams would already be in motion, probably following the same path they were. They couldn't afford to waste time. Every second counted. They needed to reach the temple first, but they also had to be ready for whatever obstacles the jungle threw their way. An hour passed, the oppressive humidity weighing down on them, sweat dripping from their faces as they pushed forward. Suddenly, the jungle cleared briefly, revealing the remains of what looked like a massive stone structure. The temple. They approached cautiously, scanning for any signs of danger. It looked abandoned, untouched by time. But there was something about the air. It felt wrong. The hairs on the back of Mason's neck stood on end. "I don't like this," Rodriguez muttered, his eyes darting around. "It's too quiet." "Stay sharp," Mason replied, her voice low. "We're not the only ones here." The team spread out, making their way through the temple's crumbling entrance. Inside, the walls were covered in ancient glyphs, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. But their objective was clear: the central chamber. They reached the heart of the temple, and there it was, the object, glowing faintly in the dark, surrounded by intricate traps and mechanisms. It was small, but its importance was clear. Before they could reach it, however, a voice echoed from the shadows. Well, looks like we're not the only ones who figured it out." The Velari team emerged from the darkness, their leader's eyes cold with calculation. Behind him, the Drexari and other cadets appeared, surrounding the human team. Corval's voice came through the comms, a calm, detached presence. "The rules are simple. The first team to retrieve the object and return to the extraction point wins. But remember, the jungle is unforgiving." Mason's mind raced, analyzing the situation. She wasn't about to back down. Not now. Not when they were so close. Her eyes flicked to Lee and Rodriguez. "Ready?" Rodriguez grinned, his hand on his weapon. "Always." Mason's pulse quickened. This was it. The final test. They had come this far, and nothing, no other team, no danger, no environment, was going to stop them. The object was within their reach, but so were their rivals. The jungle may have been a living, breathing enemy, but the cadets had become something else entirely. They were the apex predators now.